Hey friends, welcome back to another video. I'm here today with some recommendations. I love to put together a little curated list for you. If you're new and stumbling across my channel for the first time, hi, I'm Hannah. I talk about books, chronic illness, and life in Amsterdam. This is one for those of you who are experiencing summer right now where you live, or perhaps you're traveling somewhere that's lovely and hot away from your cold and wet homes. That's something I desperately need to be better at organising when it comes to the winter where I live. But no matter what season you're living in, I'm sure these books will hit just the same. But thematically, I wanted to pull together some summer holiday reads, poolside reads, even if you're just taking a little vacay at home, a few days off of work to lounge around and gobble up some books in a very greedy manner. To me, summer reading is greedy reading. It's reading things quickly, it's reading things all at once, and being able to give your attention to something. So I'm not sure I really have a rhyme or reason to why I picked these 10 specific books. I can justify each of them, I think, to you, but perhaps they're not like necessarily all romps or all thrillers. And I did leave out a few of the more obvious choices. If you've watched my channel, that you know I probably recommend all year, because I do want to get back to doing that like top 10 series that I started, to include like family sagas and literary thrillers and things like that. So I didn't want to keep repeating myself, you know, that's boring. The hardest thing about making recommendations videos is like always coming up with new things to recommend, or drawing back on old books that you think would be of interest. So that's what I did here. The first one is definitely kind of new. It just came out in paperback. This is The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue. To be honest, I'd recommend any of Caroline O'Donoghue's books, although The Rachel Incident is by far my favourite. It's her most recent, and it follows Rachel, the main person, and her best friend James. They live in like a dilapidated student house with no heating, and they have to share a single bed when the weather gets too cold in Dublin. And they're in their final year, I think, of university and trying to muddle through. And they want some excitement in their life. They want to do it for the plot. You know, that's the energy of this book, which to me, I love to read in the summer about like people making chaotic life decisions, because I'm partial to a couple of those once in a while. So this book really did it for me. It's a story of deep platonic friendship and love, but also like a lot of romantic entanglements and a lot of questions about sexual politics and sort of appropriateness of various relationships. I think this really works for a greedy read, because you follow these characters over the span of a year, and as they're like at university they're working in a bookshop, and they meet an author who's also a professor, and somehow find themselves wrapped up in his life. So this is definitely like an easy read, one that would work so well on audio, but it's sentence by sentence. Caroline O'Donoghue writes some of the most brilliant and cutting remarks for her characters, particularly these younger sort of university students. They're just so funny and biting, and their friendship is very quippy. And yeah, I don't know, it's just a really well melded pairing for Rachel and James, which I really loved reading about. And a story of friendship to me is summertime. So that's The Rachel Incident. Moving on to there's a few romantic-ish books. We know I don't read a lot of romance on this channel, but The Marriage of a Thousand Lies by S.J. Sindhu is a story of queer love in the Sri Lankan American community. This is definitely less romp and a touch more heartbreaking. But again, you feel so invested in these characters and so desperate to know how they will resolve what feels like the unresolvable. So you follow Lucky and her husband. They're both queer, but they're in sort of a marriage of convenience, or a marriage to satisfy their parents and their wider cultural community, because being queer, where in their community, is considered not an option, not something that they feel that they could live out in peace. So they get married in order to cover one another, but Lucky, and they live far away and have tech jobs they kind of hate, but they go out to queer bars together, and they sort of have made a life they feel like they can make work, although I think it's hard they're finding it hard on how to justify that to themselves, that they can't just be openly themselves with their families. Then Lucky's granny has a fall and she has to return back to like the family home and be apart from her husband, and her family starts to ask questions about him and why he's not there. And she rekindles her friendship with a childhood best friend, Nisha, who's getting ready to get married, also to a man, although in their younger days they did a lot of exploring together, and Lucky would consider Nisha her first love. So we watch the build up to this wedding as Lucky feels so torn between allowing her best friend and first love to get married into a relationship and of cover, even though knowing that's what she did herself. And it becomes very complicated as they navigate their friendship, their unrequited love. And it's a deeply moving and, you know, upsetting, obviously, in places book, but I think there's this like burning anger inside all of these queer characters who aren't able to be themselves that really propels you through the story in quite a righteous way. Like, it's a righteous anger that feels so justified and feels so, it's so complicated as well, because it's not a book. I don't know specifically about S.J. Sindhu's experience, but I believe she is also Sri Lankan American, and it feels very gently put and well nuanced when it comes to the cultural conversation around queerness and various marginalized communities in the States. But it does feel like a real necessary story, and a really beautiful exploration of that. Also, speaking of romance, I have just one more straight romance book to recommend to you. This is romantic comedy by Curtis Sittingfeld. Curtis Sittingfeld is most known, I guess, for her like chunky political retelling. She wrote the book Rodham about Hillary and Bill Clinton, but this is very different for her in a way that I really enjoyed. This is a take on the typical romantic comedy, the Harry Met Sally, the Notting Hill, that 90s story that at least I grew up watching a lot of. But Curtis Sittingfeld does it in a very, the book is self-aware of its own tropes and its own angles, which I really appreciated. So you follow Sally, who's a sketch writer for a fictionalized version of Saturday Night Live. And they have this famous musician come, like how they do on Saturday Night Live, to like come and participate in some of the skits. And Sally is responsible for organizing that and getting it all together. Sally is like one of the only women in the writer's room. There's a lot of misogyny and sort of just like men who think they're too funny for their own good. But she decides that like love really isn't for her. She has like an on and off thing with another one of the writers, who then ends up getting this extremely hot, like, you know, A-list celeb girlfriend, and his name's Danny, and they coined this term, like, I think they called it like the Danny effect, or basically Sally theorizes this idea that like funny guys get to end up dating like really hot women out of their league, but funny girls are just told to shut up, basically. But we follow her as obviously her and the musician start to talk more, and you know how romantic comedy ends. I really like the way Curtis Sittingfeld writes with such wit and smartness to her words, but it still gives you that like bubbly feeling in your tummy, which I wasn't expecting when I read this as a big romantic skeptic. So this one is definitely a lot of fun. Okay, the final book I don't have to show you, which I really need to own a copy of this specifically, is True Biz. This is a coming of age story with a difference. This is set at a school for deaf and partially hearing young people, and we followed the head mistress, who is not part of the deaf community herself but grew up with deaf parents, as she tries to navigate running the school, the complicated sort of access elements that go into it, funding, stuff like that. And then we follow a new girl who joins Charlie. She's a transfer student and she's not getting on well at her mainstream school, so her parents put her here, and it's a boarding school, and she ends up sort of running in the same circles as Austin, who's like the head boy, the star student of the school, comes from like a family of well-known deaf people in the community, but he is experiencing this sort of period of complication and confusion because he's just had a little sister who's born hearing, and in this sort of reversal of typical healthy people family experiences, this child born hearing is considered sort of out of the blue, and they're not sure what to do, and sort of how does that fit into their community, because the deaf community have like a very specific culture around their disability, which is like quite unusual, I think. Like it's specific, basically. And in this book, Sarah Novak really digs into that and explores the history. So we sit through some of the classes that Charlie is being taught about various figures in the disabled and deaf community, and the various changes to legislation to make it more inclusive for deaf people. And it is at its core like a very intellectual and interesting story that would, I think, particularly if you're not from the deaf or disabled community, that you would learn a lot from. But it is still like a really awkward teenage coming of age, figuring out yourself, figuring out romance at its heart. So it does those two things and balances them really well, which is what I really appreciate about this book. It's a quick read. It's a perfect blend, I think, for me, of like a weekend read, like not too heavy on the brain, interesting, endearing. You're very like committed to Charlie and all of her fumbles, but you're rooting for her, which I appreciate. I couldn't make a summer reading list without including at least one chunky family saga, so I'm here to remind you to read The Most Fun We've Ever Had by Claire Lombardo. I'm currently reading, or perhaps by the time you watch this I would have finished, Claire Lombardo's latest novel, but this is, as you can see, a great big book. This is the kind of thing, it's obviously out in paperback now. This is like 500 pages in hardback, which is huge, so not that practical for your poolside reading. One to pick up in your Kobo, or I'm sure the paperback is a lot more manageable. But there is something good about reading a really big book by the pool or on holiday, because you only really need to bring that and like maybe one back up instead of bringing lots of different books. So The Most Fun We've Ever Had is a family saga of like a quintessential, I think it's Midwestern, my American geography is not very good, white picket fence family, very middle class, sort of have it all, but we follow their adult children, 4 sisters who all have different things going on in their lives, and they all have to come together back to the family home for an event. You know how it goes, like that's the classic family saga setup. I really, really actually want to reread this. It has an adoption storyline. There's stories of like mental health and depression, chronic depression, managing relationships, reproductive rights, all of these, specific call outs to big ideas, but it's Claire Lombardo weaves those things into the fabric of family life so delicately that it does feel like you are just reading about an everyday family. And that's the thing about these big issues, whether it's abortion rights or depression or whatever, like those are everyday things, even though we talk about them in the like political and social context as these big issues to solve. This book really shows you how we are all impacted by one another's choices and decisions, and she's just such a good writer. Like, she can paint the perfect family portrait, in my opinion. You can't beat Claire Lombardo. So that's The Most Fun We Ever Had, and definitely one to take on a trip. The other family saga adjacent, this is more like an intergenerational story of women, is Of Women in Salt by Gabriela Garcia. This is the story of Cuban women. You can see on the back it actually has our family tree, which we love, a family story with a family tree. It's set between the 1800s, which is not a storyline I love to read about always, the 1960s and the 2010s, talking about Cuban to American migration. So in the 1800s, it's about factory workers, and in the 60s, it's about obviously like Castro and the politics and the mass exodus, and then the 2016 is about the American dream, the shattering of the American dream, the opioid crisis, addiction. And as you can see, it's quite a short book for a family saga, and it does have those relationships of these women at its core. And I really like that this book is so focused on the women of these families, particularly in the cultural context of Cuban American women, who really feel like these powerhouses of families that are unfairly responsible for keeping it all together. And I think this book does that really well. And you have those 3 timelines to follow, but you really, I guess, are being illustrated the intergenerational trauma and the impact of displacement, the impact of migration on even the next generation who are born and bred in America. So that is Of Women and Soul, also such a sick cover. Okay, then I got a little Dutch book for you, which is a rare recommendation because I don't read a lot of them, but this is translated, and it's The History of My Sexuality by Toby Lackmaker. This is a fun mid-20s sort of queer Amsterdam life novel, which I really enjoy. I really enjoyed because of its its relationship to the city, I think, is so well done. Toby Lackmaker really illustrates life in Amsterdam. Obviously, to me, it was like interesting and notable to be able to recognize all the places that our main woman is talking about. But I think even if you're not familiar with Amsterdam, it is just like a young woman living in the city. It talks about Sophie's experience, like with one night stands, her ability to love the wrong kinds of people and what you do with that, but it doesn't feel overly messy in the way like Luster by Raven Leilani does. Like it does feel like there's a bit more going on in Sophie's life than just that. And it also talks about queerness, bodies, experiences of having a body. There's some, like, Toby Lackmaker in an interview talked about like the way they just nodded to questions of being non-binary, of transition. But all in all, this is like a really funny book, and I find it hard to find books I find funny. Like that is a rarity for me. But in the summer, like on a holiday, I really do want to laugh. So this is a light-hearted, without being cheesy or corny or even overly earnest book, which is my kind of funny and relaxed reading that I'm looking for. So that's History of My Sexuality. And then to me, the queen of summer funny books is Miriam Toews. This is Summer of My Amazing Luck. To me, she writes such funny and witty characters that are so offbeat and weird. You probably know her from Women Talking, which is like her most famous book that got made into that really brilliant movie. But her backlist catalogue is phenomenal. I only have a few left to read and I'm savouring them. I am actually taking one on my own summer holiday this year, but this follows a group of women living in a housing project in Winnipeg. All of her books, she's Canadian, so her books are all set in various Canadian areas, and a lot of Mennonite history often comes into her book. There isn't a lot of that in here, but there is a sprinkling. And it's set across a very wet and rainy summer while Lucy and her young daughter are living in this housing project, and they start to meet their neighbours, and a lot of them are young women with children who are receiving state benefits. And it's about their ability to mother in poverty, in difficult experience, through difficult experiences. And it's about that community impact of the housing projects, which I'm not sure specifically about Canada, but at least in the UK, and I know in the States, that these kinds of like social housing often get same in the Netherlands, get a really bad rap. But this actually this illustrates the community aspect of that, despite the fact that the building's falling apart and they obviously are living sometimes in unsafe conditions. But there's this real sort of camaraderie around mothering and communal raising of kids, which I really loved. It didn't shy away from the difficult aspects of that, but it was done with humor. Anyway, Lucy and her friends and the kids end up going on this road trip across the border to America, and we follow them on this haphazard journey looking for a deadbeat dad. And you've probably heard that story before, but Miriam Toews writes again, with such heart and such love for her characters, such care, but it is so deeply moving because these characters are so specific and weird in places. They're so weird that they must be real. Does that make sense? So that's The Summer of My Amazing Luck. And absolutely last but not least, I have to recommend you a book that was super popular when it came out, but it's obviously been out on paperback now also for a while, and I want to remind you of the hype in case you missed the train when it first came out. This is Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendes. This follows a young man who is leaving. Well, first it starts off in the 1950s in the Black Country in the Midlands, where we watch a family of the Windrush generation sort of move into the area, experience the systemic racism and how difficult it is to find a job, and they end up finding support through religion. And then we flash forward to the 2000s, where Jesse, a young man, is leaving his life out there and abandoning the religion he was raised in, which is the Jehovah's Witnesses, to start a new life in London and reinvent himself, which he does through sex work. So we have these parallels of marginalization and different experiences as being an immigrant in the UK, coming of age, sexual politics, what it means to be a young Black sex worker in London, and how Jesse navigates those scenes. And so, yeah, we follow him on his journey, his growth, his coming to terms with who he is, like outside of his family, outside of the religion and the rules that he was raised in, and the different other like Black British young people that he meets, and how he has this found family, and how he experiences London through the eyes of people who've been there for a long time, and then how he finds himself in romantic relationships and how that works with also being a sex worker, and all of these big questions. But again, it's written with such grace and care for these characters. And this is another one I really want to reread. That's the good thing about making these, is I'm reminded of books that were so good I need to read them twice. Paul Mendes' prose are poetic and floral in places, really beautiful and cutting in others. So I think he's a really accomplished writer, and we should hopefully be getting something new from him soon. But in case you want to keep up, that's Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendes. Those are the books I have to share with you for my poolside summer reading list. Let me know what you think, if any of them are of interest. I would love to know what you're reading at the moment. Leave it in the comments, or if you're planning a trip, I'm packing some books with you too. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.